Snow hammered the pavement like shards of glass when Aaliyah stepped outside the diner with a tray of fresh coffee. Her fingers were numb, breath trembling in the icy morning air. And then, just 3 steps away, a tall white man in a tailored coat slipped hard on the frozen curb, his foot kicking out, body crashing backward. The world didn't give her time to think. Aaliyah dropped the tray, grabbed his coat sleeve with both hands, and pulled him toward her, stopping his skull from smashing against the concrete. The coffee exploded across his chest, steam rising in the freezing air, her heart pounding as she held him upright. He blinked up at her, stunned. She whispered, breath shaking, "Sir, you hurt? It has already made your blood boil, tap-like. And subscribe so you don't miss stories where justice finally wins." Chad, one of the city's youngest billionaires, though she didn't know that yet, looked dazed, embarrassed, struggling to stand. Aaliyah kept one arm behind his back, steadying him, her voice soft but urgent. "Please tell me you're okay. That coffee didn't hit your skin, did it?" He stared at her hands. They were trembling more from fear than cold. Before he could answer, the diner door slammed open. "Aaliyah!" Mr. Carter's voice sliced through the air like a blade. He stormed outside, his face twisted with anger. "What have you done now? You threw hot coffee on a customer." Aaliyah shook her head fast. "No," he slipped. "I was trying to help him. Don't you lie to me." Carter snapped. "I saw the spill. I knew hiring you people would bite me one day." Chad's mouth opened slightly. Aaliyah waited, begged silently, for him to speak. Just one sentence could save her. But Chad stayed frozen. Carter grabbed her by the arm, yanking her up from the ground. Her elbow slammed into the metal doorframe, pain shooting up her shoulder. "You're done. Fired. Right here. Right now." She choked out, "Mr. Carter, please, please don't do this. I swear I didn't hurt him." He slipped. Her voice cracked in the cold air. Inside, customers watched through fog glass, silent. Aaliyah stood trembling, coffee soaking her apron, breath shivering, dignity slipping through her fingers, just like the man she saved. Chad finally whispered, "Wait," but Carter spoke louder. "Get out." Aaliyah lowered her eyes, swallowed her pride, and stepped away into the falling snow. She didn't know yet that saving that man would cost her everything. Aaliyah walked through the biting cold with her torn apron stuffed into her bag, each step heavier than the last. The city felt louder today. Every engine, every honk, every gust of wind hitting her like judgment she didn't deserve. She kept her arms wrapped around herself, not just for warmth, but to stop her hands from shaking. 2 blocks away, the snow got thinner, replaced by cracked sidewalks and flickering street lamps. This part of town always looked tired, but it was home. Aaliyah pushed open the door to her small apartment above a pawn shop, the warm air greeting her with the smell of old wood and last night's rice. Her younger brother, Malik, peeked from behind the curtain. "You're home early, everything okay?" She forced a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Yeah, just slow today." Malik didn't push. He never did. He was trying to finish community college while working late-night shifts. She wasn't going to add her burden to his. Aaliyah stepped into the kitchenette, boiled water, stared at the stained wall while the kettle hissed. Her elbow throbbed from Carter's yank, but she rubbed it quietly, hiding the winds. Across the city, Chad sat in the back of his luxury SUV, staring at the faint brown stain drying on his expensive coat. His driver asked if he wanted a replacement sent from the penthouse, but Chad waved him off with a distracted hand. His mind replayed the moment over and over. The slip, her hands catching him, Carter screaming, her pleading voice. He'd fallen on ice before, but he had never been caught like that. Never been saved by someone who looked at him with genuine fear for him, not herself. He hated how silent he'd been. He hated that he froze. The SUV passed neighborhoods he'd only seen in financial reports, redevelopment zones, low-value land, future acquisition sites. Now the boarded windows looked like people he'd stepped over without seeing. Aaliyah spent the evening scrolling through job listings she already knew wouldn't hire her. Food service, cleaning shifts, retail. Everything required availability she didn't have, or experience she already had too much of. She shut the phone off before the despair turned into tears. She sat by the window, watching snow drift under the streetlight. Her mother once told her, "Baby, life will try to bend you. Just don't let it break you." Tonight, she felt the bend. Across town, Chad lay awake in a penthouse bed that cost more than her entire apartment. But for the first time, the silence around him felt earned, because he had let a woman like her walk away humiliated, and he knew this wasn't over. The next morning, Aaliyah returned to the diner for one reason only: her final paycheck. She needed it for Malik's books, for rent, for groceries. Survival didn't wait for dignity. She stepped inside quietly. Customers ate in silence, the smell of bacon thick in the air. Carter stood behind the counter, pretending she didn't exist. I just came for my check," she said softly. Carter didn't look up. "You'll get it when I finish the paperwork. Sit." She sat on the far stool, hands folded tight in her lap. Every minute felt like a punishment. Workers in the back whispered, side-eyeing her, pretending they didn't see the bruise forming on her elbow. The diner bell jingled. Chad walked in. The entire room shifted. Even Carter stood straighter, smoothing his greasy apron and forcing a smile. "Sir, coffee? Breakfast? Anything on the house?" Chad's eyes found Aaliyah instantly. She lowered her gaze, unsure if he'd come to speak or to avoid her again. He approached slowly. "Aaliyah, about yesterday," Carter cut in fast. "You handled it with such patience," he told Chad loudly. "These workers, they get emotional." Aaliyah's jaw tightened. Chad tried again. "I should have said," but Carter pushed right over him. "We can't let behavior like hers ruin customer experience. I did the right thing firing her." Aaliyah whispered, "You grabbed me. You hurt me." Carter snapped, "Watch your mouth." Customers began watching. A hush fell. Carter folded his arms. "You're collecting your check and leaving. That's it." And then Aaliyah stood, bruised arm shaking, voice barely holding steady. "If I hadn't saved him, he could have cracked his head open, and you fired me for it." I stared at Chad. Every second begged him to speak. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. "If this happened in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you stand for fairness, hit subscribe." Carter slammed a folded paycheck onto the counter. "There, now get out." Aaliyah blinked fast, trying to stop the tears rising. She reached for the check, but Carter snatched her wrist. "You think you're special because you grabbed a man on the sidewalk," he hissed. "You people always play the victim." Aaliyah jerked her hand back, breath shaking. The room stiffened. "Mr. Carter, stop." Chad finally spoke, but it came out too soft, too late. Aaliyah looked at him. Just 1 second. One moment of eye contact. He looked away. Her heart cracked in that moment. Not because Carter was cruel, but because a man she saved still couldn't speak for her. She tucked the check into her coat. "Thank you for nothing," she whispered. Carter barked, "Don't come back here. Ever." Aaliyah pushed past him, stepping into the cold morning air. She swallowed her pain, her pride, everything she wanted to scream. Inside the diner, Chad stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the spot where she had been. He whispered to himself, unheard by anyone, "She saved me and I couldn't save her." And that guilt began to spread like a crack across ice. Deep, silent, unstoppable. Aaliyah walked home with the check balled up in her fist, knuckles white from holding in everything she didn't say. The wind cut across her face, but the hurt in her chest burned hotter than the cold. She kept her head down as she climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment, praying Malik wasn't awake yet. But he was. He sat at the table with an open notebook, rubbing his eyes. "You're back early again." Aaliyah forced a breath. Slow shift. Nothing big. Malik tilted his head. He saw the bruise on her elbow. "What happened to your arm?" She pulled her sleeve down, slipped on the steps outside. "I'm fine." It was a lie. The truth would break him, and she already felt broken enough for both of them. She poured him cereal, the cheapest kind, the type that turned soggy before he could finish it. Malik ate quietly, watching her with worry. He tried to hide. She smiled through it, because someone in this home had made things feel okay. When he left for class, Aaliyah stood alone in the apartment, staring at the paycheck in her hand. 1 week's pay. Not enough. Not even close. She changed clothes and headed out again. The church kitchen smelled like onions and warm cornbread, the kind that hugged your spirit even if your life was falling apart. Volunteers moved around in a rhythm she knew well. Miss Loretta spotted her first. "Baby, you look tired." Aaliyah tied an apron around her waist. "I need to keep busy." No one asked questions. Here, people understood pain without needing to see the details. Aaliyah chopped vegetables, stirred pots, handed out warm bowls to folks who had even less than she did. Every "thank you" soothed a little of her shame. Work here didn't come with racism, or humiliation, or Carter. Just purpose. Across the city, Chad sat in his penthouse office, staring at documents he couldn't read, numbers blurred. His assistant knocked twice. "Sir, the redevelopment presentation you haven't signed." He couldn't. Not today. His mind kept replaying her voice. "I saved him and I got fired for it." He pushed away from his desk, grabbed his coat, and walked out. The snow outside had turned to wet slush, soaking the hem of his trousers as he walked through neighborhoods he'd only seen on maps. And then he stopped in front of the church basement window. Through the fog glass, he saw her, Aaliyah, sweating over a giant pot, sleeves rolled up, bandana tied neatly, helping strangers the same way she tried to help him. She didn't see him. She didn't look his way. She didn't need to, but Chad felt something heavy settle in his chest. He had ruined something he didn't even understand, and he wasn't sure he deserved the chance to fix it. Chad returned to the diner the next morning with a cold knot in his stomach. The bell above the door jingled, but something felt missing. The warmth, the noise, the sense of rhythm Aaliyah brought with her presence. Carter looked up and instantly plastered on a fake smile. "Mr. Sterling, back again so soon? Coffee? Breakfast? Anything, all on the house." Chad didn't sit. He didn't touch the menu. He didn't even blink. "What you did to her was wrong," he said quietly. Carter froze. "Sir, I fired her because she assaulted a cuss." "No!" Chad's voice cut sharper. "She was helping me. I slipped. I caused a spill. You grabbed her. You humiliated her. You lied." A silence dropped over the diner. Even the cook stopped moving. Carter's mouth twitched. She was trouble. People like her stopped talking. Chad said, stepping closer, "Before you say something you can't take back." For the first time, Carter looked nervous. His false confidence cracked. Chad didn't yell. He didn't need to. Quiet power always hit harder. He walked out, leaving Carter standing alone in the wreckage of his own behavior. Outside, the air felt different. Colder. Clearer. Chad pulled his coat tight and headed toward the neighborhood he'd been avoiding all week. The one he was planning to redevelop, which in reality meant displacing dozens of families like Aaliyah's. But today, he couldn't pretend anymore. The church came into view, warm lights glowing through frosted windows. Voices echoed from inside, laughter, clattering dishes, the hum of community. He pushed the door open slowly. Aaliyah was wiping down tables, her hair tied under a neat red bandana. She didn't look up when he entered, but the room noticed. A tall white man in an expensive coat stood out like a missing puzzle piece. He approached carefully. "Aaliyah?" She stiffened but didn't stop wiping the table. "What do you want now?" Her voice wasn't angry. It was tired. The kind of tired built from years of being overlooked. "I went to the diner," he said softly. I told him the truth. She didn't turn. "Good for you." "I was wrong," he added. "I should have spoken up that day." Still wiping. Still not meeting his eyes. "That day is gone," she said. "So is my job, and my rent isn't waiting for your apology." He swallowed hard. "I'm not here to make myself feel better," he said. "I'm here because I want to help." Aaliyah finally turned to him, eyes steady. We don't need saving. He nodded. I know. And we don't need pity. I know. She folded her arms. Then why are you really here? He exhaled. Because I realized something. You saved me that morning, and I made your life harder. I can't undo it, but I can show up. If you'll let me. Her expression didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. Aaliyah stepped closer, eyes narrowing. Words are easy for men like you. Showing up, that's the real work. There it was, the shift, the test, the challenge. If you believe talent can silence every insult, share this video. And to everyone watching from US, UK, and Canada, your voice matters. Aaliyah pointed to a stack of pans near the sink. Dishes. Start there. Chad stared at them like they were investment contracts written in a foreign language. You said you wanted to help, she added. So help. He rolled up his sleeves. The community watched quietly as the billionaire lowered his hands into soapy water for the first time in years. He scrubbed until his fingers turned red. He rinsed pans until steam covered his glasses. He didn't complain. He didn't quit. Aaliyah watched from across the room, not impressed, not moved, just watching, letting the work speak louder than his guilt. For the first time, their worlds touched, not on ice, not in fear, but in effort. And it was only the beginning. Chad returned to the church the next morning before the sun even rose. The air was still blue, the streets quiet, frost clinging to railings and windows. He expected to beat the volunteers there, but Aaliyah was already inside, sleeves rolled up, sorting bags of donated groceries. She didn't look surprised to see him, just said, "Gloves on the shelf," without lifting her head. He slipped them on and got to work. By noon, they'd prepped meals, packed boxes, and cleaned every counter twice. Chad's back ached, his hands burned, but he didn't complain, and Aaliyah didn't praise him. The silence between them felt like a test he was willing to take. Around them, the community whispered, not loudly, not rudely, just puzzled. What's a billionaire doing scrubbing our floors? Guilt must have hit him hard. The girl he let down, that must be her. None of it mattered. He wasn't there for applause. Later that week, Chad's board held a meeting about the redevelopment project. He sat at the head of the long glass table. Papers laid out neatly in front of him. Investors waited eagerly. It was supposed to be one of the most profitable deals of the quarter. Chad looked at the numbers, the profit margins, the eviction estimates, the families on that block, Aaliyah's neighborhood. He closed the folder. I'm canceling the project. The room erupted. Canceling? That's millions. You can't just... This isn't strategic, it's final. Chad said, find somewhere else to build your luxury units. I'm not displacing those people. The silence that followed was an agreement. It was shock. He didn't care. Later that afternoon, he returned to the diner, not for food, but for a reckoning. Carter looked up, instantly panicked. And Mr. Sterling, good to see you. This business is under my investment group, Chad said. You didn't read your contract, did you? Carter stuttered. I mean, yes, but you violated workplace conduct, Chad continued. You assaulted a worker. You made racist remarks. And you lied to cover it. Carter's face drained of color. You're terminated, Chad said. Effective now. The diner workers stared in stunned silence as Carter stumbled out the door. Chad left without a victory smile. Justice wasn't performance. He found Aaliyah at the church, handing out warm bowls of soup. I fired him, Chad said quietly, and I canceled the redevelopment. Aaliyah didn't react right away. She set down the ladle, wiped her hands on her apron, and faced him. Why? Her voice was steady, testing him again. Because it was the right thing to do, he said. No, she stepped closer. Why did you do it? He swallowed. Because you deserve better than what I gave you. For the first time, her eyes softened, not trust, not forgiveness, just a crack in the wall between them. And for Chad, that crack felt like hope. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the city. The snow melted into thin rivers along the sidewalks. The air warmed, and sunlight finally pushed through the weeks of gray gloom. Life didn't transform overnight, but it shifted, inch by inch, the same way healing does. Aaliyah stood outside the church steps, handing out bags of produce to neighbors lined up around the block. Kids laughed behind her as volunteers set up tables. Her elbow had healed. Her heart, not fully, but it was no longer raw. She turned when Chad approached quietly from the side, not with fanfare, not with flowers, just a small, honest presence. "I talked to the board," he said. "I set up a community fund in your mom's name. It'll support job programs, rent assistance, and scholarships. If you want to look over the details." "I don't need the details," Aaliyah said gently. He paused. "Why not?" "Because it's not my charity. It's my neighborhood strength. And if they trust it," she nodded toward the people gathered, "then that's enough for me." Chad exhaled, almost relieved. "I'm glad." Aaliyah picked up 2 bags and handed them to an elderly couple. When she turned back, Chad was still standing there, waiting, but not expecting. That mattered. "You know," she said, glancing at him, "you didn't have to do any of this." He looked down at the ground. "I know. And you didn't do it to fix me." He nodded. "No, I did it to fix myself." Aaliyah studied him for a long moment. The man who once froze in fear now stood, with a quiet humility in his shoulders, sleeves rolled, helping hands steady. It wasn't a redemption story. It was a correction. "You learned something," she said. Chad's voice softened. "You taught me something." They stood in silence, not awkward, not heavy, just real. Cars rolled by. Kids shouted. Volunteers called orders across the yard. Life moved on, and so did they. Aaliyah tightened her scarf and stepped down from the church steps. "I got a job," she said finally. "A real one. Front desk at the community center. Benefits. Steady hours. I earned it." Chad smiled, small but genuine. "I never doubted that." She gave him a look that meant, "You doubted a lot of things." But forgiveness wasn't a sentence. It was a process. As they walked toward the doors, the afternoon sun hit the pavement just right, reflecting the spot where the ice had once nearly broken a man's skull and nearly broken her life. Funny how things worked. She saved him on that sidewalk. But in the end, he saved a part of her world, and she saved the rest of his.